Aloha and welcome to Island Connections. I'm Ibrahim Aoude. Globalization and Empire 2. Actually, this is a sequel or a continuation of a program we have done last semester with Manfred Steger, professor of political science at Mānoa, and has affiliation with the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, ARMIT, in Melbourne, Australia, of course. So welcome again, Manfred.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming over to share your ideas with us. And since this is a sequel or continuation of Globalization and Empire 1,
right.
Maybe it would be good to remind our viewers about what we think about or what you think about globalization, and we go from there, because I remember you were talking about globalization, and I know your idea is that it is a connectivity,
Mm-hmm.
So what does that mean? And what kind of globalization are we talking about?
Yes. Basically, we have really three important concepts or terms that I think are very useful, and we might want to keep them separate, even though, of course, they're connected. The first term is globalization. The second term is globality, and the third term is globalisms. Mm-hmm. So by globalization, I really, or most people, referring to processes that are going on in the world that have to do with the expansion and the intensification of social relations across world time and world space. So that's really, really new, in a sense that even though we've had previously in history worldwide interactions, the planet is shrinking, and the speed and the frequency with which people interact or connect with each other, you talked about interconnectivity, mm-hmm. Is really unprecedented. Mm-hmm. So people kind of have invented globalization back in the 1990s as a term to indicate that tremendous increase of interconnections. Mm-hmm. So that's the process. So if globalization is the process, then globality is the condition of interdependence or interconnection. So the process is moving us towards globality, but this doesn't mean that we're there yet. And I think we're probably going to talk a little bit about that, mm-hmm. today too. Nationalisms still exist. Mm-hmm. There's still obviously a lot of tensions. There are political borders. So I think globalization is moving us towards globality, but we have not reached that condition of total interdependence yet. Mm-hmm. And then finally, globalisms, that's the concept that I use to indicate that globalization is not simply going on in the world out there, but it's also going on in our heads. It's also going on in terms of the kinds of shared mental maps that people use to navigate their social and political environments. So globalisms, like all isms, are ideologies, that's shared ideas and values that people hold with regard to society and politics and economics. So when I talk about globalisms, obviously people have isms about globalization. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it about markets? Is it about contesting capitalism? Is it about a new religious paradigm in terms of making a kind of a religious belief system global? So there are several globalisms, market globalisms and justice globalisms and religious globalisms that are contending with each other, that are struggling with each other. Mm-hmm. So I think the important thing to take away is that globalization is not just this kind of objective process in the world out there, but it's also a subjective process in people's heads, and those are dialectically connected with each other.
Yeah, and that's why, you hear the term in a global world, in a global world, and then you hear in a globalizing world.
Right.
So I think you agree with the second
yes,
thing,
I
globalizing
think so.
world, for all the reasons that you mentioned.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
And one other thing about justice globalism, market globalism and religious globalism, and there may be several others.
Right.
These are all like kind of ideas that are thinking of, are interacting or trying to deal with the real world as it is globalizing.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. So they're all dealing with, you can say, the external world, but because the external world, as we all know, is deeply embedded in culture and deeply embedded in ideas, it's kind of like the chicken and egg problem, right? In other words, there are real processes in the world, such as economics, but those are only understood and mediated through ideas. So it's a kind of a back and forth, which ultimately, I think, in many ways, as many thinkers have thought, that real processes, material processes, certainly are just as important as ideas. So I think neither side has a right to say, oh, well, it's all about ideas or it's all about materials.
Yeah, and as you said, chicken and egg kind of thing. So it's a two-way street.
It's a two-way street.
And of course, the real world makes you like interact with it, and then you begin to form ideas about it. But then as you're interacting with the real world, you are interacting with through your ideas.
Exactly.
And therefore, this like dialectical relationship.
Exactly.
Yeah. But that reminds me of this old thing, Kant saying, I think, therefore I am.
Yes.
And then the Marxists say, I am, therefore I think.
Right. Right.
Were it not for the material world, then. So these are all like, social reality, or as you said, the external world.
Absolutely.
But we are part of the external world,
Absolutely.
so yeah. So that's, I wanted to mention that. But then if we are talking about, globalization as a process, then what do we make of that process? I mean, who's doing the globalization? I mean, is it like, a natural order or something? Or is there like forces, social forces, material forces that are making that globalization? And if that's the case, which I know you think there are these social forces, who are these forces? I mean, what are they?
I think that's very good, and I think that also relates to something I didn't mention before, and that is that globalization has various dimensions or aspects to it. So when we think about globalization, primarily we think about economics, we think about markets, and that already answers your question, that I think that given that this world is increasingly dominated by various forms of capitalism, some people refer to it as a global capitalist system, then surely much of globalization is being driven by those capitalist forces in reaction to other social forces that oppose this particular kind of globalization. So there's an economic dimension to globalization, but there are also political dimensions to globalization. If you think of the UN, for example, is it, to some extent, the UN is an important driver of globalization. Some people say it might be a step towards what they call global or world governance, which we don't have yet, but might be moving towards. And there certainly is also other forms of globalization, such as cultural globalization, which we talked about already, and I think increasingly importantly, environmental or ecological globalization. In other words, the interaction between human activity and the physical planet. So you could say, who are the drivers there? Obviously, human beings and the material activities are very important drivers, but the natural environment in reaction to that then also becomes a very important driver of globalization as well.
Yeah, right. Like I'm thinking like about the Amazon, like mostly in Brazil, right? And you have like these poor peasants eking out an existence, right? And what they do, like they kind of quote unquote destroy the Amazon slowly so that they can like plant something, because they are being deprived of ag land and all that, the fertile one. So should we like blame those poor peasants for the destruction that they are doing to the Amazon, which is actually is very important for the global climate, etc.? Or are there some other forces that compel those peasants in Brazil, for instance, to do that which they are doing.
I'm very glad you're asking this question because, very often those examples are being used without the larger context, again, the global context. And the fact is that there is tremendous global inequality in the world, particularly between what people call the global north, which means the more industrialized, the more now post-industrialized countries, and the global south, the developing countries. So these activities of those small farmers that you're talking about, the Amazon, occur within a context where they are structurally disadvantaged and where they exist in a world of tremendous inequality. So in many ways, they have very little choice. Always when there are inequalities, it reduces choice. So I think rather than just blaming them for their activities, one should really look at the larger global forces that produce those forms of inequality that push people into certain directions. In addition to that, I think what's also really important to mention in this is that the real culprits in terms of, for example, the destruction of the Amazon, are not the small peasants.
Absolutely.
The real culprits are very large, ranchers, agricultural forces, corporate agriculture, timber companies that are pushing, obviously, the development, so to speak, of that region, and also draw into their orbit a lot of poor workers who become part of this movement, or you could say of this dynamic that is really environmentally very, very suspect. So I think if you compare the activities of small farmers with the activity of those large corporate forces, you will find that the corporate forces are doing much, much more damage than the small farmers.
Yeah, and in fact, because of those corporate forces, these small peasants doing what they're doing,
Exactly.
just to eke out an existence, so they don't expire within a year, out of starvation or something. Yeah. So I think that's why I asked that particular question. Then I'm reflecting on another thing, like in terms of globalization as a process, right? Is the question of migration of peoples, etc. I mean, Trump and others. Trump wants to build a bigger wall and militarize the wall in a big way with machine guns or whatever. And there already is a wall between Mexico, and the United States. But the fact of the matter, no one asks, why are these people from the south coming to the north, right? And this, it seems to me, not seems to me, there is research on this about agribusiness going to Mexico, for instance, or other places, and wiping out the small farmer, And so what do? Roll over and die, or, go and find something to feed their families, and they come to the United States.
Yeah, I think that's a really very important point. And, for me, migration is one of the strongest social forces in the world and has been for many, many centuries. I think what's new about migration in this world, as you mentioned, is that the numbers involved, obviously, are much, much larger. The means that migrants have to communicate with each other and make that large, distant kind of movement possible are much more developed than they've ever been before. And unfortunately, I think it's probably true that very few people would want to leave the place that they call home, that they were, born in and they grew up. So it's a hard thing for people to leave their home. So why would people do that? Only if they feel that their situation has become desperate to the point where they feel they have no future. Yeah. And I think in many ways, this goes back to the inequality, global inequality that I was talking about. That increasingly the world community has to realize that the migration problem at its very core is really a problem of inequality and unequal distribution of resources that pushes people, in many cases, out of places that they'd rather not want to leave, but have very little choice.
Yeah. And, many of these migrants leave their families behind and they don't see them for years or what have you. So, this is like heart-wrenching kind of situation. Yes. And then you blame the victim for coming to the United States without seeing what the role of the U.S. corporations and also the U.S. State machinery, like the government, like facilitating the interests of the corporations in those countries that create even more poverty and so forth. So that kind of migration happens, and that's part of the globalization process.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I would go so far as to say that it's not just all the United States. It's the emerging great powers. If you think of China and the activities of China in Africa, that are also largely responsible for a lot of that inequality, the way the resources are being exploited and people are not being paid what they're due. Or if you think of the role of Russia, for example, in Syria, which is obviously, I'm referring to the civil war in Syria, and the fact that this has been a major migration, political refugee disaster. You know much more about it than I do. But as you know, out of 23 million Syrians, 7 million are either internally displaced or have had to leave their country, mostly to neighboring countries, but also increasingly to Europe. And that obviously is part of a dynamic that involves power struggles, among the various large powers in the world.
Yeah. No, that's true. Except, like to say that China and Africa and even the Pacific, like Papua New Guinea and stuff like that, is a rather recent role.
Yes.
Right. But at the same time, they're doing this, and in fact, with all these kind of dislocations that happen in the Chinese economy, I mean, you have internal migration. Like we're not talking about 2-3 million people. We're talking about like 250 million,
Yes.
250 million people, displaced, dislocated, and so
Yes.
forth. This is an expression of the dislocation in the economy, etc., to move the Chinese economy into a capitalist style economy.
Absolutely.
And so forth. So these are like really, if one wants to assess or evaluate globalization as a process, you cannot just look at like the hunky-dory kind of stuff that happens, skyscrapers, and like, for
Startup
instance,
companies.
in like Abu Dhabi or Dubai or something like that. But you got to look at these kinds of things that are
Absolutely.
really, against humanity in that sense. So before we had like, say like 18th, 19th century, 20th century, early 20th century, we had like so many empires, right? So we had, the British Empire. Everybody, a British Empire, okay, it's taken for granted, right? French Empire taken for granted, this empire, that empire. But don't you ever think of saying U.S. Empire? But actually there was a U.S. Empire. We know from the history, right? I mean, Cuba, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Philippines, as main stepping stones for the U.S. Empire.
Yeah, I think what's really important, I'm glad you're bringing that up, because I think what's really important for our viewers also is to see and to understand that empire really has two different types of meanings. So the way we talk about empire, I think we should distinguish between two forms of empire. The first is the form that you referred to in the 18th or 19th century, if we think of the French Empire or if you think of the British Empire, which is the acquisition of overseas territory and a direct political control of those territories. That would be the kind of classical definition of empire, right, by a central, usually European force. But then there's also informal empire, which is not exerting direct political control, but you exert a lot of indirect political control through, for example, military bases that you may have in that country, through a certain economic system that you can control, it's through certain kinds of political manipulations that you might be able to do. And certainly, I think in those terms, you could definitely think of the American empire as an informal empire that I would argue is continuing to this day. If you think just in terms of military bases, we have 650 military bases around the world.
And installations.
And bases around the world. And no other country has that kind of, tremendous military presence.
But it's all because of protecting democracy and freedom. Has nothing to do with U.S. corporations or finance.
That is what the surface message very often is. But obviously, most educated people, I would argue, in the United States are capable of looking through that kind of superficial gloss.
Yes, yes. That's very important. And then perhaps it's important to mention like how the U.S. System, international system, let's put it this way for now, was in contradiction to the old empires like British, French, etc. And like they wanted those countries in Africa and Asia to become free.
After World War II, especially.
Yeah, after World War II, especially after World War II. Yeah, I mean, Lebanon, Syria, 46, for instance, they became independent.
Yes. African states.
Yeah, Algeria in 62 and others in the 50s and so forth, and Africa, and later on. So this is the reason why basically is obvious, because the U.S. was expanding, its influence over the world, and has nothing to do with freedom and democracy. We can prove that, right? Which we might talk about it later on. But for investment purposes, because if you are in India under Great Britain at the time, the Americans wouldn't be able to invest in India because it's territory for investment of British interests.
Yeah, I think that also brings us back to this idea of freedom and democracy, because I think again in the American context, or very often in the Western context, not just in the American context, freedom and democracy are inextricably linked to the idea of capitalism and free market, so-called free markets. Yeah. And therefore, when they talk about freedom and democracy, then they really mean capitalist freedom and capitalist democracy, which is not the same thing as freedom and democracy from the point of view of a more critical perspective that is not necessarily bound within that capitalist system.
Right, and it's from the point of view of the native peoples, wherever they might be. So this is an important thing. So perhaps and there is some debate about it, in terms of terms. Perhaps a better term might be imperialism rather than empire, to denote the question of the difference between what we might call U.S. empire, but maybe U.S. imperialism, as opposed to the British or French empire or whatever empire.
Well, imperialism is also a 19th century term, and in many ways it just basically connotes the idea that empire can become an ism, a mindset, a political belief system that is, of course, backed up by material forces, right? So in that sense, I think imperialism is older. For me, the real big distinction is, are we talking about a kind of a classical style, direct empire, or are we talking about a kind of a formal empire, or are we talking about an informal empire that doesn't explicitly exert control, but indirectly exerts control? I think those.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, there's that debate though between what kind of term you want to use, or in fact, actually, Samir Amin talks about global capitalism, right? And the question of monopoly capitalism, just like Sweezy and Baran and all of that, to denote these kinds of new dimensions and new transformations in terms of globalization, capitalist globalization, and so forth.
Well, I think one of the major, since you're talking about globalization and empire, I think one of the major changes that happened in the last 50 years in this regard has been, I think, the deregulation, or the shift from what I would call regulated Keynesian form of capitalism that achieved certain degrees or higher degrees of social equality in certain parts of the world, certainly not in all parts of the world, but in certain parts of the world. And I think what we've seen in the 80s and in the 1990s, interestingly enough, under both Republican administrations in this country and Democratic administrations in this country, is the deregulation of the economy, is the so-called liberalization of trade, is the privatization of what used to be socialized enterprises that were working to fulfill real needs that people have in the name of the public good. So we have seen those kind of movements of deregulation, liberalization, and privatization that I think have really changed capitalism worldwide and made it, in my view, much more like the kind of capitalism that used to exist in the 19th century when we read Charles Dickens novels, where social inequality and the disparity between wealth and well-being was just very pronounced. And I think we have forgotten after World War II, with this regulated form of capitalism, that capitalism is always tending to want to push back. And I think globalization, in a way, has helped capital to be more flexible, to be more movable, and thereby we are kind of moving back to, you could argue, back to an era of real pronounced forms of social inequality.
Yeah, but on a global scale.
On a global scale.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think very important.
On a global scale, but I think also within national scales. I'll give you an example. Just in the United States, I'm not sure if our viewers are aware of the fact that the average working class family in the United States in the 1970s was making exactly, in terms of adjusted for inflation dollars, exactly actually 10% more than they're making now. In other words, over 40 years, income for those families has actually slightly declined. Whereas income for the top 1% of income earners in the United States has increased by almost 400%. So this is the inequality that exists on a global level is also reflected on a national level in most countries around the world.
Yes, absolutely. Now, like, you have more poverty in the United States, more people on the edge, just like they can slide anytime, into the precipice of poverty and so forth. Yeah, but and that's part of, and we can see it like, in Flint, Michigan, for instance, or in Benton Harbor, Michigan as well, with the question of water and all of that. You can see it all over.
Yes, and you can see it in Honolulu, Hawaii, right? We had recently a very, I think, a really good newspaper headline on the front page saying that 48% of our population lives from paycheck to paycheck.
Yeah, paycheck, right, yeah.
So, that tells us that even here at home, things are quite unequal and quite precarious.
Yeah. No, and I thought you were going to say something about the homeless.
The homeless too, yes.
Because it is, it is like, a statistic, that actually Hawaii has the highest rate of homelessness per capita.
Correct, in the United States.
In the United States. So here we go. I mean, this is also part of that kind of process of globalization. Because one of the things, we might not think about it as globalization, but when you have, like, if you are in the middle of Chicago, Michigan Avenue, for instance, or something, and you radius, like 500-mile radius around Chicago, this used to be like 50s, 60s, 70s, the most industrialized place probably in the entire world. And now what we're talking about, smokestack industries, and that's what's happening in Detroit. Detroit is a basket case now because of this process of globalization.
Deindustrialization.
Which is deindustrialization that brings this notion of post-industrial capitalism and all of that. But this, people don't think about it as part of the globalization process. And this has to do with, shall we say, empire or monopoly capital or... Yeah. So, would you like to expand on that?
Well, I think it also has to do with the idea that what we are seeing is that the composition of capital is changing. Meaning that capital used to be about the production of commodities that you could see, that you could touch, that you could actually, hold or use, in other words, real material things. And what we're finding increasingly, and we saw that very dramatically reflected in the global financial crisis of 2008 is that capital increasingly is not about producing things, but it's about investment. It's about what's called finance capital.
Right.
So what we are seeing is that more and more money is being made by money.
Yes.
Not by actually producing things.
And money it's always been a commodity, but now you can trade in that commodity. Before it used to be like, okay, I give you $5, you give me something, But now, no, you trade in money and exchange rates and this and that, and you make money, you lose money, etc. But it's all like.
But I think it's even worse.
Ethereal.
I think it's even worse because I think in many ways you're being very kind by saying that you're trading. I would say you're gambling.
Gambling.
People talking about casino capitalism, right? People
Yeah.
talking about instruments, for example, those securities that became toxic and created were part of this global financial crisis. Those are highly artificial instruments that are, not so different from actual, instruments that you would use somewhere in Las Vegas or in Macau,
that's right.
and therefore,
Give me a couple of chips.
Exactly.
$5.
Exactly.
No. I mean, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. No. That's. I think very interesting because. Actually, what that kind of development in finance and financial instruments, etc., that really created this bubble in the housing market, because then I'm trading with you things that I don't see, I don't feel, I don't touch, I don't smell, and all of a sudden the whole thing goes down the tube. If you are a homeowner, finito la musica for you, finished, right? I mean, and that's why a lot of people became bankrupt. But you didn't bail me out, you bailed the banks out instead of bailing me out, which created more of a problem. Okay? And here, the relationship between profit, financialization of capital, shall we say, and on the one hand, and then the other side of it, the deindustrialization of capitalism or capital. Okay, but when we say deindustrialization, well, we're still riding cars, which you can touch and feel and brake and all of that. So production went all over the world, seeking greener pastures for profit, etc. On the one hand, creating more poverty in the United States itself, right? And on the other hand, creating more exploitation of the workers wherever they might be in China or wherever. Okay, so that's part of profit, exploitation of the people, the producer, wherever they might be, and also the pauperization of people in the, these highly rich countries like in the United States. So you have poverty among wealth, right?
Well, this is part of, when you say globalization and empire, what I think of very often are those kinds of new social formations that many people are aware of but don't really pay attention to. So for example, when you talk about the outsourcing and the production of things that used to be produced in the United States somewhere else, what we also have, or what's part of this, is what's called global commodity chains, right? That certain products are actually being produced in multiple locations around the world, and what capital does is it takes advantage of labor differentials and produces at the cheapest possible rates. Very often this is called the race to the bottom, in order to bring to the market, goods that, from a consumer point of view, are very welcome because they're kind of lowering the price. So if you go to Walmart, you can get very cheap commodities. On the other hand, from the point of view of somebody who wants a job in the United States, in the manufacturing industry, this is really a disaster. This is really kind of taking away your job. So I think each person has to think about this in this new age of globalization from 2 points, right? From the point of view of consumers, of participant in this kind of global capitalist dynamic, you might be very happy about having cheap commodities. On the other hand, from the point of view of a wage earner or a salaried person, this is a very, very problematic development that actually takes money out of your pocket rather than puts money into your pocket.
Right. Yeah, that's very important. But also, you have, for instance, in terms of that, globalization, we see not only that there are like differentials in each of the states, like whether it's like a wealthy state like the United States, or like, I don't know, Republic of the Congo, for instance, this is like, huge. So there's poverty there, but there's a lot of rich people, not as rich as in the United States, but a lot of rich people in the Republic of Congo. I mean, and then there's a relationship between these rich people there and these rich people
local
here.
elites.
Yeah,
yes,
global
absolutely.
elites, etc. That leads me to talk talking about finance capital or monopoly capital, which is global at this point. And then the relationship between that monopoly capital, etc., and the expansion of that capital, and the question of globalization, right? Because I need the natural resources of the Congo or some other place like Uganda or whatever, or Nigeria for that matter. And so as finance capital, I would invest there to get those kinds of, especially if I am like oil corporation or what have you. I invest there, and then doesn't matter who gets, who dies, who gets poor, and so forth, etc. But then you would look at, because of our investments there, like a lot more people are now joining the middle class, but they don't look at, and then so that we have to do more of the same, so that everybody rises to the level of the middle class. They don't look at the relationship between a few people rising to the middle class and the rest of the population getting poorer and poorer. So could you say something about that process?
I think that, very often what you hear is that globalization has lifted millions and millions out of poverty. Now, as a blanket statement, there's absolutely, a dimension of truth to that. If you look at absolute numbers, and you look at particularly at China, because most of that really has to do with China, and you see, in terms of income, what people were earning, mostly rural population, versus the kind of low incomes that they are now making in an urban setting, you can say, okay, there are millions of people who have been lifted out of poverty. But I think what gets lost in this debate is, again, I hate to come back to that, but is the fact that millions more have stagnated or actually lost income as a result of that. So what you could say is, and I think there's very, very good empirical evidence, there's been 2 studies that I've seen recently that really lay that out very clearly, is that globalization for the poorest of the poor, say the bottom 5% of the population, has been a slight improvement. It certainly has been a huge improvement for the top 5%. But for a lot of poor people, it's actually been either stagnant or it's gotten worse. So in that sense, we have to really not just believe those slogans, but we have to look at very critically at data and very critically at empirical evidence that shows us that the picture is much, much more complicated than that.
Yeah, and I remember like from the last program we did together, you mentioned like the top 1% owns 40% of the wealth.
Exactly.
And then the bottom 1% owns less than 10% of the wealth.
The bottom 50%.
Less than 50%.
The bottom 50%.
That's right. Bottom 50%
owns less than 10%.
Less than 10%. That's right. Yeah. So that tells you something.
It's a huge, huge number, right?
Yeah, come on, give me a break in terms of you talking about globalization. I want to show this book of yours. a very short introduction, Globalization. It's a very good book, very short introduction. Could you say something about it?
Yes, this was a book, this is now in the 3rd edition, and I'm working on the 4th edition as we speak. But this was an attempt to make accessible to students and to a general readership, in a nutshell, what is globalization about? So what I try to do in this book is not just talk about the various dimensions of globalization that I already mentioned, and kind of in factual terms about globalization, but I also wanted to talk about globalization in normative terms, meaning, is it good, is it bad, and if so, for whom? Is it good, for whom is it bad? So I tried to infuse my discussion with the kind of discussion that we have here, which means that you can't talk about globalization apart from those normative issues that have to do with inequality, that have to do with disparities in wealth and well-being, that have to do with the global South that's being left behind. Yeah. So this book is trying to bring together both an introduction to the various dimensions, but also this normative discussion.
Yeah. So I'm just looking at chapters 3, 4, 5, and 6, which is interesting, the dimensions, economic dimension, political dimension, cultural, and ecological. And we talked about that. And then whether globalization is a new phenomenon or not. And I remember you were saying it's like, shifting gears in a car.
Yes.
It used to, we started with gear number 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. So it accelerates.
It's accelerating, yes.
Yeah, and therefore it's like a process and so forth. But I also think about it in this term, like, that acceleration and that, process in terms of like inventions, scientific inventions, etc. Could it have happened without this high tech, especially like, the computer, Internet, and all of that? But whether you talk about medicine, advances in medicine, etc. So one dimension to me, I mean, I'm not talking about these 4 dimensions, but one dimension of the notion of globalization would be like, we cannot conceive of it if we're not talking about the age of high technology.
Yes.
Yeah. So
absolutely.
So it's globalization in its 5th or 6th gear. It's in the age of high technology because this is the basis of.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that technology has always been connected to globalization. So if you think of previous periods of globalization, for example, the 16th century, right after the capture of the Americas and the inclusion of the America in this kind of world system, one of the very important technologies was the book. Right, we have the printing press, and we have the book being a technology that allowed high tech that allowed people, to know about the world and to connect and communicate in ways that it was never possible on that large scale. Right, so you're right that technology is always connected to globalization.
Because a lot of people think like, oh, you're being mechanistic when you talk about technology, etc.
No.
Actually, the whole human progress,
absolutely,
or progress in quotes. Is because like from the bow and arrow, blah, 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 etc.
Absolutely.
So I just wanted to mention that because a lot of people have like this kind of weird idea about, oh, you're being reductionist. It's not that. It's just, that's what it is. That's how societies are built.
That's how societies, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So, another book, since we're talking about globalisms, etc., you have that book called Globalism. It's the 3rd edition, The Great Ideological Struggle of the 21st Century. Would you care to say something about that?
Yeah, well, this is a book where I talked about those 3 isms, right? Yeah. These globalisms that we talked about. I said that there's a dominant ideology of globalization that I call market globalism.
Yeah.
Some people refer to it as neoliberalism. And that is a dominant one. That in many ways you talked about the drivers, right? Drives a lot of the direction and the forms that globalization is taking, but it's being challenged by 2 other isms. One I call justice globalism, which is kind of questioning this kind of capitalist direction where where things are being produced on the basis of profit rather than real need. And then it's also challenged by what I call religious globalism, which is religious belief systems that could get together with capitalism actually to some extent, rather easily, that see the world though in terms of, in universal terms, as being connected through their religious belief. So whether that's Christianity, whether that's Islam, whether that's to some extent Buddhism, many religions have that universalizing or that globalizing impulse that's part of it. And we've seen that attempt to expand religious belief systems in recent decades.
So it's an interesting book because you're talking about the ideology, right?
Yes, exactly.
Because we have globalization as a process, and then globalism as ideology and multiple forms of that ideology.
Exactly.
Yeah, just like in Christianity we have multiple ideologies of Christianity.
Absolutely,
etc.,
absolutely.
So or any other religion for that matter. And then the rise of the global imaginary.
Yes.
Political ideologies from the French Revolution to the global war on terror. So what prompted you to...
That's basically a big historical attempt to look at, it says from the French Revolution to the global war on terror, right? To look at the development of ideologies, development of political belief systems over the last 250 years. And basically my
I'll
argument...
show it here.
Great. Basically my argument is that ideologies have, over the last 200 years, moved from what used to be a very national context, a context of nation states that formed ideologies and determined in many ways what those ideologies are about, to a context where ideologies too are becoming globalized, and no single nation anymore has this ability to kind of frame or form an ideology just in its own image. And I think what you were talking about before when you talked about the different forms of capitalism, for example, right? We get different variations of belief systems that then kind of become globalized or are being connected to people around the world. So what I call then the global imaginary is this idea that people increasingly develop a sense of imagining what's possible, imagining how they belong together, how they hang together, how they're connected with each other, not in a national context, but in a global context.
Yeah, but in this globalization, very short introduction, you have also in chapter 7, ideologies of globalization, which you expanded on there. And that is, we mentioned them, market globalism.
That's right.
Justice globalism, religious globalism,
That's right.
yeah. So I just wanted to show.
So you can see that what really interests me the most about globalization is really the forms of ideas and values that are being created by those material processes.
Right.
And in other words, again, the chicken and egg problem, right? While I'm mostly interested in the ideas and in the values, I'm very cognizant of the fact that those ideas and values are being generated and react back to material processes that have, very concrete drivers that we were talking about.
Okay, now we're talking, globalization and empire.
Right.
And you think when we talk about the financialization of capital, and there's monopoly capital financialized, etc., we're talking about the entire world becoming like one body, right? However, if you look at the world, you find there's all kinds of blocks, whatever these economic blocks, political blocks, etc. Most famous of which is actually the European Union, right? We have ASEAN, we
APEC.
have,
APEC.
The APEC, we have the Shanghai Group now and all of that. So why is it then, if we are globalizing, why is it we see these kinds of blocks here? Is that a contradiction, or are we not reading things correctly?
No, I think this is a great question, and I'm very glad that you're asking this, because in many ways, when I talk about globalization, one of the things that I want to make clear to people from the beginning is that globalization is really glocalization.
Yes.
Right? The global and the local together. And what that means concretely is that usually when we think about globalization, what we're looking at is this kind of spatial level of the global, right? Whether it's the UN or whether it's the World Trade Organization or the IMF. And obviously, globalization functions on that global level. But what we're forgetting is that the subglobal levels, the regional, the national, and the local, are also spaces where globalization occurs. So in other words, it's not that globalization is just isolated on that global level, but within regions, within nations, and within localities like global cities, Shanghai, New York, and Tokyo, there's a lot of globalization happen there. So we shouldn't think of globalization just as happening on the global. We should think of globalization as localization. And in that sense, then, regions become sites where globalization is occurring. Right?
Yeah, the other thing, I agree completely. And the other thing, and I know you agree with that too, which is that, in fact, because the capitalists as a class, they're not all united as one, etc. They have like problems among them. They have blocks, as Polanca's talked about, blocks BLOC, a capitalist block and so forth. So they want to protect their own kind of market so that they can become richer than the other guys, say in North America or whatever. So there is that particular competition that creates crises or helps build towards crisis in the capitalist, global.
Absolutely, I think one of the best, one of the best situations recently that we've seen that at work, for me, was the Iraq War of 2003, right? And that is when certain blocks or sectors of capitalism were very reluctant and very unhappy with the idea of starting a war because they felt that their business interests were really threatened by the insecurity that this war would bring about, right? Whereas other industries that had to do with war making and so on were very happy with,
mercenary guys
because
too,
that would mean, their profits would go up. So I think that's a great example of how within capitalism there are real competing sectors and blocks, right?
Yeah, and also I remember reading an article a long time ago, 2003, Peter Gowan, I think.
Yes, the Global Gamble.
And talks about like how you have like the U.S. as the main capitalist center and there's no other competing capitalist center. And to really get out of the domination that the U.S. has as an empire or as an imperial, hegemon, you have to find another kind of capitalist center that can take these functions away from the United States or share it with the United States to move away.
That's right.
And this is one thing that the U.S. has as a strategic goal to not have the European Union out of its sight or out of its domination, because actually now the U.S. does not really have the EU as an ally, but it's like on top of the EU.
Well, I think this touches upon something that perhaps we have a few minutes time to talk about, which for me is Peter Gowan was talking about this like 15 years ago, and I think what has shifted, as we all know, is this discourse about newly emerging nations or the great powers, right? That we're shifting from this era of a hyperpower, the United States, which certainly was the case at the turn of the century, to an era where we have rising powers. And sometimes this is being expressed in the acronym BRICS, right? BRICS.
Brazil.
And that's for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, right? As examples of new powers, or you could say old powers, that are kind of now challenging the United States. And if that's the case, and I think in the case of China, certainly, one would have to say that there are new capitalist centers that are emerging. If you look at the stock market, say in Shanghai, and compare that to New York or London, Tokyo, it's comparable, these days. So what we are seeing, I think, in interesting ways, is on one hand a pluralism of powers. In other words, a greater diversity than used to be. And on the other hand, though, we're seeing more uniformity in terms of more and more parts of the world taking on capitalism in different ways, but still capitalism is this kind of basic economic system.
Which leads me to the question of if you have like competition among these centers or, would-be centers, etc., then where are we in terms of world peace? I mean, and this is a major thing because, I mean, the United States, for instance, don't want anybody else to share with me anything if I can help it, of course. And so there are people who might be pushing for, war and all of that. And it becomes dangerous given what's really going on, especially in the Middle East and Africa, for that matter, even like sub-Saharan Africa, right? Nigeria and the Congo and all of these places. So there is the question of world peace being threatened.
Yes.
So this is like the imperial imperative, creating these kinds of developments that are not congruent with world peace. And that is, I think, dangerous.
Well, I think you put your finger on a central dynamic, and that is, in many ways, we are not where we are supposed to be. In other words, our political structures, our mindset in many ways is still like in the 20th and 19th century in a world of nations and competing nations with each other, whereas all of our problems, or the major problems, you could say, the ones that we talked about today, right, having to do with inequality, having to do with climate and the environment, having to do, you could say, with food and other kinds of issues, are global issues.
Yeah.
So the greatest impediment, you could argue, and I firmly believe that because, I consider myself a cosmopolitan. I think the greatest impediment these days is our inability to actually tackle those global problems as in a more global political sense. And we're still kind of hiding behind our borders and our national mindsets.
Absolutely, yeah. And we still have like 2-3 minutes. I want to introduce this thing, maybe like a subject for another program, which is like the notion of neo-fascism coming up. And, a lot of people think of fascism as a political thing, like, Hitler or whatever it is, or one fascist party or Trump or what have you. But they don't know that these guys are an expression of certain things. And, in terms of fascism as an economic thing, which is the merging of the state with the corporations. And we see this happening in the United States, in a big way. Not only in the United States, but the United States in a big way.
Across the world.
Absolutely. But we're talking, say, as an example, the United States, especially after the global financial crisis and the way, like the presidents Bush and then later on Obama chose to deal with it, which is like enrich the corporations more and more. So now we have that kind of merger. And then all these politics and political structures and legal structures, like even the Patriot Act, etc., are to put in place political structures, legal structures to deal with the question of the merger of the state and the corporation. And that creates, in fact, a lot more threat to peace. So you're from Europe originally, and you know about all these things that happened during World War II. So could you comment on it?
I think we know very well these tendencies, what you call fascist, or what we could be called proto-fascist. Some people call it national populism, extreme right-wing nationalism from Europe. But I think what we're kind of overlooking, and this is why I'm always a critic from the outside, is that we have very, very similar tendencies in the United States. You could say that Donald Trump and Ted Cruz, who now are the last two, pretty much. There's a third one, but he doesn't have a case. He doesn't have much chance. The two, men standing, so to speak, on the Republican side, are both people I would call, without hesitation, proto-fascist. Meaning they are those kinds of national populists we have seen in Europe, like Berlusconi. Right. And in that sense,
in Italy,
in that sense, I think what we're witnessing is that this country that has prided itself, many for long years, of not being like Europe and not being, subject to those tendencies, is actually falling exactly into the same types of patterns that we are seeing.
But if Ted Cruz wins the nomination, then he'll have to show his birth certificate because he was born in Canada.
Actually, a Texas judge just ruled yesterday that he's a natural-born citizen. Unless it's challenged and goes to the Supreme Court, I think he's going to be.
Because Ted Cruz is from Texas, right?
Yes, that's right.
But it could be a challenge. But anyway, I was just kidding. So actually, we still have. We ran out of time, in fact, and so. We didn't get to your website here, but your website is the Sociology department, right?
Yes, and it's very easy to get in there if you just go through the main Mānoa website.
Right.
And you go to departments and you go to Sociology, you get my website.
Yeah, and then you see like the types of publications you have and so on.
And my background.
Your interest and background.
Interests. Yeah. That's right.
Well, thank you, Manfred, for coming over.
It's wonderful.
And thank you for our viewers, and mahalo nui loa, and see you next year,
Mahalo.
like in September.
Mahalo for watching us.